Time for a big effort Ork video then. Let's talk through the strengths and weaknesses of every model in the Ork army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today I thought we'd do another Ork video. Already a fair bit has changed since the Codex first came out, around about 6 months ago now. Some things have been buffed and nerfed, and I thought it would be worth going through each and every Ork unit, talking about their strengths and weaknesses, and giving each unit an overall power rating for how strong I think they are in game at the moment. As there's a ridiculous amount of Ork units to look at, we will be moving fairly quickly. If I miss any important things, feel free to let me know down in the comments, and in this review we will be mainly focusing on the Ork Codex, not all the wild and wonderful Forge World stuff, as I strongly suspect that this video is going to be long enough as it is. In any case, let's jump straight into it. We'll go through each section in the Codex in turn, and we'll start off with the troops. So first up we have the standard troops of the Ork army, the boys, currently 9 points per model, and you can take them in squads of 10 to 30. I must admit, I don't think that the new Codex has been kindest to boys. They really excelled in the previous book when you could take them in big 30 strong mobs and have them basically immune to morale. Now a lot of their stratagems and options for those big units have been depleted. They will lose a lot of units due to morale unless you pay a lot of command points to stop it, and in general people tend to run smaller units of 10 as opposed to a huge horde style mob. In any case, still for the 9 points, it is quite intimidating to put so much toughness 5 bodies on the table. They are a troop's choice with objectives secured. You're going to need at least some troops in the army for filling those detachments, and just with the sheer weight of attacks they can put out some fairly hefty melee, much more so in the Goths clan than in other clans. I think the boys get a lot better if you use them as truck boys, though you can only have one of those per detachment. Being able to zoom them halfway across the table in a turn is really quite powerful, and if they do get into combat with vehicles, they do have handy tank buster bombs with which they could deal a bit more damage. In general, besides the issues that are mentioned, they are relatively slow for a melee unit, a little bit hard to deliver, and aside from those tank buster bombs, they can struggle against high save targets. Overall, I've ranked them 7 out of 10, a bit disappointing for one of the army's key units. They can do their job, though I just don't think that they're massively standout. I'd say broadly speaking, it is a fairly similar story for Beast Snagger boys. The extra 2 points per model gives you a 6+ invul save and a strength 5 attack with a bonus against vehicles, and they can be a bit more survivable as well, as they have access to that sort of transhuman physiology stratagem where they can only be wounded on 4s. They can also ride in kill rigs, which is a bit of an advantage, but otherwise I think they've got fairly similar weaknesses to boys. Plus, if they are just targeted with a bunch of mass anti-infantry shots, losing each 11-point model is pretty painful when they're still only lightly saving on 6s. Gretchin I think are in a really weird place in the troop slot, basically being absolutely terrible in terms of an efficient unit that's going to give and receive damage, but still perhaps the most competitive troops just because of how cheap they are for filling the slot. I would actually rate them just a little bit higher than boys. I've rated them 8 out of 10, primarily because you can just fill the troop slot in a couple of cheap units of Gretchin for 50 points. They'll just as easily sit on a backfield objective out of line of sight, just like the boys, do things like actions without having to care about wasting all that greenskin muscle, and they're one of the better units for screening and can use grot shields if you'd really like to, though it is a bit expensive. They're a good choice for their specialist mob as well. The Horrible Gits can give them obsec. Obviously, besides scoring objectives and screening things, I wouldn't actually expect Gretchin to do much. They're not really good in terms of damage or defense to be honest, and their leadership will make them run away even faster than regular boys. I do think that all units of the troops are usable, but I just don't think that they're going to be the most spammed units in the Codex in the stronger lists. Moving on, let's take a look at the heavy support section next, starting out with the mighty Battle Wagon. Battle Wagons in general were a unit I was quite down on the release of the Codex, but now they've all dropped by 15 points. I think that the standard version of the Battle Wagon does look really quite interesting. Unupgraded, it's 105 points, which is super cheap for 16 wounds at toughness 7 and a 3+ save, particularly when Ramshackle keeps it safe against damage to low strength weapons. For a few extra points you can actually make it into a genuine credible melee threat as well for a death roller, which I would generally take, and it just seems like a fairly efficient transport, either for zooming some boys or meganobs towards the enemy, or acting as a bit of a battlefield bunker for something like looters or burner boys. Quite nice that they can fire out of it with open tops. On the downsides, I really wouldn't waste many points upgrading it. The upgrades seem very expensive for what they do, and a lot of the time you might be just as well off with a cheap truck compared with shelling out for the premium option. Still though, I wouldn't be surprised to see a few of these appear in Ork lists. I think they're just nice and cheap for the toughness and transport, plus some nice melee threat from the death roller. I've chosen to rank them 8 out of 10. Unfortunately, despite the similar points drop, the gun wagon and the bone breaker I still think are overshadowed. They're 150 points or 160 points respectively. Compared with the battle wagon, the gun wagon gets +1 to hit with its kill cannon, and I just don't think that that's really enough to justify the extra cost. It is a bit tougher with toughness 8, but it does trade off that firing deck, which I think was quite useful. I feel it's quite similar for the bone breaker as well. Again, trading out of the very nice open-topped firing deck is annoying, and the main incentive to take it is that its death roller gets an extra d6 attacks on the charge, which is handy, but I just don't think it's worth the extra 40 points over the standard battle wagon with the death roller. I've chosen to rank them 6 out of 10 overall, not useless, but completely overshadows. Next up we have the Death Dreads, a heavy support choice at 85 points base, and you can take 1 to 3 of them in a squad, then them all go in their own separate way once you deploy them. Death Dreads feel like okay battle line units, have a nice mix of shooting and melee. Perhaps one of the most interesting loadouts are things like multiple custom mega blasters or rockets, plus a claw so it still fights well. They've got ramshackle, they can use ramming speeds to get a longer charge off if they need one, but I just don't really think that they compete amazingly well with things like the buggies in terms of damage and defense. Particularly compared with the buggies, they're just nowhere near as fast whatsoever, so might struggle to get into combat. Killer cans I think have become a fair bit more interesting, seeing as they went 5 points down at the last chapter approved. They're now between 35 and 50 points per model, depending on what gun you give them. I think perhaps their main asset is their defense. You do get a fairly good amount of ramshackle toughness 5 wounds on the board for their cost. They've got reasonably accurate shooting for orcs, and get +1 attack when they're in 3 models or more. The main downsides are bad leadership, giving you a good chance of the remaining killer cans running once you kill 1 or 2. They don't get a clan culture, and again competition from the other orc damage dealers. Still though, I'd probably rate them a little bit higher than the Death Dread in terms of just a battle line unit. I've chosen to rate them 7 here. I could have been persuaded to put them up to 8 out of 10, since their points cost dropped. Next up we have the Flash Gits, 25 points per model heavy support, and they get 3 shots at strength 6, AP-2, damage 2. They do have a 4+ ballistic skill, though their weapons are heavy weapons, meaning that if you move and shoot them, they're going to be hitting on 5s. The damage output is okay, it is fairly generalist, and I think that the biggest attraction to actually take them is their 2 command point stratagem, allowing the entire unit to fire all over again if they target the closest enemy. They do have a bit of melee threat against light infantry as well. They could follow up their damage with a charge, if it makes sense. Perhaps their biggest weaknesses are their drop off in damage when moving, and their kind of problematic interaction with transport vehicles because of that. If they're in transports, they're often going to be moving, so are taking the penalty, and they also can't use that 2 command point stratagem from within a transport, which means you usually want to get them out. That also creates its problems though, as they aren't particularly tough if you can target them directly, so they just seem like a bit of a hard unit to use well. They do also have a bit of competition from the tank busters and looters, both of whom compete for the orcs with guns role. Next up we have the Kill Rig, a very imposing choice with its crazy utility, 210 points per model. It did go up fairly significantly in chapter approved, taking a 20 point hit. I can perhaps see why though, it basically seemed like a model that just did everything pretty well. The Whir Tower gave you 2 useful casts with the Beast Head Discipline or Smite. It transports 10 Beast Snaggers if you want to. Its shooting is not too bad with the auto-hitting Whir Tower and the Heavy Lobber. The Heavy Lobber has a stratagem that can allow you to slow down a unit, really quite good for messing with the enemy's movement. It's got decent melee, reasonably tough at toughness 8 and 16 wounds. It does have a 6+ invul and ramshackle as well, and as if that weren't enough, it's also a character unit as well, giving it a heroic intervention and the option to take relics like the Scorched Git Bones. I think it was somewhat undercosted before, so I'm not surprised that they raised the price a bit. I think its main challenge is that it's going to struggle to use all of those diverse abilities at once to good effect. The terrain could certainly limit its movement a bit with that massive base, and its durability is just a bit less efficient now the points cost has gone up. I've chosen to score it an 8 out of 10 here. Again, I was kind of on the fence with this. I could have easily been persuaded to put him up to a 9 out of 10 just as happily. Next we have its partner in crime, the Hunter Rig, on a 160 point model, so now it's quite decently cheaper than the Kill Rig at 50 points less. It's basically the same profile for that big 50 points, but you basically lose 2 psychic casts, the Whir Tower's shooting ability, and the fact that it's a character that can heroic intervene and stuff. It does gain a touch of transport capacity, so it may be better if you want to just use it as a dedicated transport, for which I do still think it's pretty good. Kind of a shame that it's locked to only transporting Beast Snaggers though, and the Kill Rig still existing does put this at good competition. I still think that people are probably likely to take the Kill Rig more often than this, even at the higher points cost. Still though, it does seem very solid. Next up we come to the Light-Fingered Looters, 15 points per model and a heavy support choice, with good general purpose dagger gun shooting at strength 7 AP-1, damage 2. They've got good range, and they do get 3 shots at 24 inches now, which is nice. They'll do well with anything that boosts stacker weapons, particularly things like bad moons, and as orcs with guns, they do make quite good use of boss bunkers or transport vehicles. That helps mitigate one of their biggest weaknesses, which is that they're fairly easy to kill for the points. Otherwise, when they're on the board, they are fairly slow. They're locked into taking mechs, so you can't just get pure def gunfire, you have to mix it up with things like custom mega blasters, and maybe the strength 7 damage 2 profile just isn't the most meta pick at the moment. There's a lot of -1 damage about, and it means that they're a lot less efficient against medium vehicles that have that rule. Overall, I've scored them a 7 out of 10. I think they do have the potential to shine against the right targets and the right army, say things like Drukhari skimmers, but definitely have a fair few downsides. Next up we have the mech guns, which are one of my favourite heavy support choices. 45 points per model if you're taking the custom mega cannon, which to be honest I would. Only 40 points if you're taking one of the other variants. I personally feel that these are very near auto-include for most orc armies, provided you have some heavy support slots free. They're just really cheap for their defensive profile and firepower. 6 wounds at toughness 6 and ramshackle is really great for 45 points, as are D6 strength 8 AP-3 damage D6 shots from those custom mega cannons, all hitting on the very nice Gretchin ballistic skill of 4+. They are a Gretchin unit, so they don't get clan cultures. They have low leadership, which means that you never really want to take more than 2 of them, I think, and they do have very little movement as well. But I think for most armies you can't really go too far wrong with them, just a few of them plonked down in your deployment zone somewhere, and giving enemy armour or elite infantry something to worry about. Perhaps fortunately not something that you can spam an entire army of these days, but still an incredibly efficient unit for the ones that you can take. I've chosen to score them a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the elite section next, and we have the burner boys. The orcs with flamers are 11 points per model, and they're very efficient anti-infantry when they're up close with all of those auto hits. They work particularly well with open-topped transports like trucks or battle wagons, a fairly fearsome drive-by potential up close, and they can suddenly flex into a melee unit by activating that cut-in flame stratagem, giving them all AP-2. Again, like the looters, they are locked into taking mechs. They aren't going to be very good against heavy targets, and again, compared with things like standard boys, they are relatively expensive for their toughness. Losing 11-point models for 1 wound and a bad save can be pretty painful, even if they do have toughness 5. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10, maybe on the upper end of that. I feel that they are quite a nice unit for damage dealing. It's just not very helpful that they're not going to be very good at dealing with heavies. Next up we come to the commandos, who did have their points increased quite recently, going up to 12 points per model. Despite that, I still think that they're going to get taken, though maybe in a bit more of a limited capacity than they were before. For the premium, you get to do forward deployment shenanigans with them, screening out the enemy, doing early game objectives or actions, or maybe even doing cheeky charges on light infantry who they can bully. They are very well suited to that role as well. Surviving on midfield objectives is a bit easier when they get very decent cover saves. Even at 12 points per model, if you're in light cover you can have toughness 5 and a 3+ armor save, and that's seriously hard to shift for the points. Their melee's kind of okay, but they do get much better near terrain where they get that +1 to wound thing. And they do also have the fun option of a weirdly cheap power claw for just 5 points rather than the usual 10. I still think that even with that small nerf they are going to be taken for that role, but now perhaps even more in the role of just 60-point units to do the basics, and I think that the 2-point nerf maybe hurts the more damage dealing squad where you take 10+ models and use some of the fun upgrades like bomb squigs. It's kind of a shame that those fun options are locked behind 10 model squads. Still though, I still think they're going to see a lot of play in competitive lists. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10. Next we have a couple of the orc medics in inverted commas, the Pain Boy and Mad Dog Grotznik, 70 points and 85-point characters respectively. They give the aura of Feel No Pain plus healing individual models, though the Sawbones rule does come with a very orky bit of unreliability, a small chance to hurt your character or model more than you help them. They are quite cheap characters, they've got reasonable melee with their power claws, and for the extra 15 points Grotznik allows him to advance and charge and is a bit tougher, though he does come with the downsides of being locked to death skulls, must make charges all the time and cost those extra points. I think the main issue with these is more that big boy squads don't tend to be the way to go quite as much, and that basically makes the Feel No Pain not quite as worth the investment, a lot of people tending to leave these at home in favour of other options, more often from the HQs. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10 overall. They are useful enough, but probably a character choice that's kind of hard to justify when there's a lot of other good options to choose from. Next up we have Meganobs, which I think have become really quite an interesting unit, again having dropped by 5 points down to 30 points base. They're fairly tanky at 3 wounds at toughness 5 for a 2+ save, not bad for that cost. have got reasonable anti-elite melee damage, and have quite a helpful stratagem on offer for +1 damage when they need it. That could really help out against anything with -1 damage, or just 3 wound infantry in general. They may be a good unit for concentrating a whole load of force for trucks or battle wagons, even if they do take a bit more space, and both these guys and the regular knobs can also be truck boys, so could be used like a bit of a missile to just throw into the enemy ranks. I'd say the points cost cut has made them into a more strong unit, but not thoroughly undercosted. They're still weak to anything with high AP and high strength. Lacking an invul save is a bit painful for elite infantry, and they are kind of slow once they're out on the transport. They might struggle to reach a second target if the opponent's quite fast. Overall though, I think they've become a much more interesting unit. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. I have a feeling we'll see at least some people experimenting with them. Next we've got the cheapest character in the book, in the Ork Mech for 25 points. He basically heals 1 wound on a vehicle each turn, which over a few turns could easily justify his points cost. And then I suppose the fact that you've got a little character running around with a half decent shooting attack is a bit of a win. As a cheap character, he could be interesting for bearing warlord traits and relics if you needed to, though I think that most are better placed elsewhere. I guess my main criticism is that he's just a bit nothingy. He's not really going to accomplish very much. He's not going to heal vehicles as much as a big mech, so again just doesn't really feel very necessary. Seems like one that could pile on enough wounds to maybe justify his existence, but you might be better off with a big mech for the same role. Next up we have the knob with the war banner. He's 70 points, and he only really does one job, giving you a +1 to hit in melee that works on all Ork units, not just core ones. If you're trying to buff core units that way, you're almost certainly better to take a war boss, as he's only 20 points more expensive and fights enormously better. Meaning I guess that this guy's there more for non-core units, perhaps things like the Lords of War, like Stompers or gorkanauts or gorkanauts. Even if you're applying the buff to something so big, I think it's still a tiny bit underwhelming. And in general, I just don't really see many people spending 70 points on this one buff, when at least a lot of the other Ork characters both provide a buff and also fight semi-decently in melee. I've chosen to rank him a 4 out of 10 overall. Next up we come to the knobs, 18 points each as an elite choice, and basically feel like boys but a bit more concentrated, with fewer models but more attacks per model. They're strength 5, get 3 attacks each, and have quite an interesting double chopper build that you can fill with them, so every single knob for 18 points can be throwing out 5 strength 5 AP -1 attacks. That does sound good, but when you consider that they're twice as expensive as a regular Ork boy, it means that they're just not enormously meaningfully better. They can have very flexible loadouts if you want. You can take lots of combat weapons and combi weapons, and things like big choppers and power claws are a bit cheaper than you'd find elsewhere. In general, I think they're usually going to be a subpar pick compared with boys or beast snaggers, seeing as they don't fill troop slots and aren't obsec. I'd say maybe one of their primary roles might be concentrating force if you want to just make best use of a truck or battle wagon's transport capacity, and you want to fill as much greenskin melee into those slots as you possibly can. Again, I believe they can be truck boys, so that could be a fun use for them. Overall though, I've ranked them a 6 out of 10. I think in general they're still just a bit outclassed by the standard lads. 30 points for the guy who stopped your Gretchin running away quite so fast, usually 35 with the Squig Hound, to make him actually do his job quite well. He is very cheap, very easy to include as he's slotless if there's a Gretchin unit, and there is a reasonable chance that he will make up his points cost in cowardly grots running less. If he does manage to kill an enemy infantry model or two, then so much the better. The main problems with him is that unless there's lots of grots about, it's really not really worth it. By the time you've spent 35 points on this guy, that's basically another 7 Gretchin towards a 10 grot squad, which might be more useful. Generally just fielding waves and waves of Gretchin isn't really a good idea, as they don't really do much in terms of damage or durability, and he's not able to help out mech guns or killer cans, who might be able to make better use of not running away so much. Overall, I've ranked him a 6 out of 10, definitely usable if you're fielding mass Gretchin, though I think that most people aren't doing that. Finally, for the elite section, we come to the tank busters, 17 points per model, and as their name would suggest, pretty efficient at blowing up vehicles with their rockets, getting +1 to hit against them. As their rockets are D3 shots, they're kind of good against anything with 6 or more models as well. 3 rocket shots per model is going to leave a bit of a mark, even if they won't hit quite as well. As well as that, they can take bomb squigs, which are quite efficient. They've got the tac muster bomb if they fight in melee, and you can do that slightly memey tactic of putting them all in a big head boss bunker, teleporting that into battle, and that gives them a really nice tough firing platform, and they count as not having moved. Again though, they most certainly have their weaknesses. Their missiles are heavy weapons, so they're very inaccurate if they're moving and not targeting vehicles, and 17 points for the standard Ork profile is incredibly flimsy durability. Unless you want them to die straight away next round, I kind of need a transport vehicle or a boss bunker to hide in. I've chosen to score them a 7 out of 10, not a terrible damage punch if there's loads of vehicles in the meta, but definitely have their weaknesses and maybe a bit monodimensional. Next up we come to the Deathcopters, a fast attack unit that's getting maybe a bit more relevance now that the tournament rules were updated a bit, so you can't field quite as many buggies as you could. Deathcopters are 50 points per model, come in squads of 3 to 6, and I think have really quite a lot going for them. They're great in Speed War or Great War if you're fielding Ghazghkull. Extra AP on the missiles is very nice, and they'll love to be freebooters for hitting on force. For how quickly they move, they do have really quite decent range and melee, have Ramshackle for a bit of defense against damage 2 weapons, and have really quite an interesting potent combo of having good melee, inbuilt deep strike, and being able to use ramming speed, a stratagem that gives them a really good chance of making a charge out of deep strike, and surprising the enemy with a whole bunch of spinning blade attacks out of nowhere. Finally, they do really like any +1 attack type bonuses, as that would generate 3 extra spinning blade attacks per model. Perhaps their main downsides is that they aren't a core unit, which does limit access to some of their buffs and stratagems, and they're not the most durable unit around either. That is a bit of a trade-off for their speed. Still though, they do seem like a very solid unit in Freebooters Speed War, one of the more competitive Ork builds, and I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10. Next up we have another set of new models in the Squighog Boys, 25 points per model, and they do get some pretty hefty melee stats for that cost. They're quite fast at 10 inches, are a core Beast Snagger unit, Beast Snaggers giving them access to a few helpful stratagems, including that transhuman physiology type one. They're particularly strong in armies that make their combat better, such as Goths or Snakebites, and really like being in a standard wild attachment that isn't Speed War, and also being able to take a bomb squig is quite nice. They are quite efficient for the mortal wounds they throw out. As for weaknesses, maybe the biggest one is that their cavalry rule will mean that they interact fairly badly with terrain, often having to go round and make their charges longer, and in general you don't really want to be fielding too big squads of them, as they do have a pretty terrible leadership of 6. Overall though, I think they're kind of hard to go too far wrong with, pretty efficient for the stats. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. Next up for the fast movers, we have the Storm Boys, the military-minded orcs that cost 11 points per model at the moment, and basically like boys with a lot more utility. They have the potential to go really fast with 12-inch movement base, and automatic 6 inches advances at the penalty of having a chance of one of them dying, and if you want them to, they can descend from the sky via deep strike. A lot of people seem to like using them for objectives and actions type things, dropping out of nowhere to do retrieve data type things, or maybe using them in death schools to just jump up and swipe an objective away with OBSEC, and only being a couple of points more than regular boys, they are still really quite efficient in terms of melee. They'll be able to chop up squads of light infantry fairly well, as well as death schools that do really quite like being Goths or Blood Axes, both of which bring their own benefits. Overall, I think they're a really handy unit for winning the mission, though perhaps it would seem not quite points efficient enough to be your primary damage dealers. I don't think you're going to see many people just ranking up several squads of Storm Boys just to charge straight down the enemy. I think they might need to be a little bit cheaper than that for that purpose. In any case, I do really like them. I've scored them an 8 out of 10. Again, I could have happily scored them a 9 out of 10, perhaps somewhere between the two. Next up we come to the Knob on Smasher Squig, a slightly weird fast attack choice in that he's a 65-point character, and he's basically a mini but quite serious melee threat, mainly due to dealing out somewhere around 2 or 3 mortal wounds on average every single time he charges, then followed up by a whole bunch of big chopper attacks and jaw attacks after that. If you can spare a command point, you can also use him to bear relics or warlord traits. He can take the kill chopper if you want to make him a bit more dangerous. On the downside, he just really doesn't do all that much besides just kill some enemy units. I think it was a bit of a missed trick not to give him some synergy with the Squighog Boys, maybe at least giving them his leadership. And again, like those boys, he does have the limitation of cavalry and terrain. Maybe might work a bit better as a bit more of a countercharge unit, a fairly dangerous little threat lurking in the ranks. I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10, maybe on the lower side of the 8s this time though. Next up we come to the Warbikers, a ridiculously efficient unit, 25 points per model, and capable of putting out some hilariously fearsome dagger gun fire for the cost. When you trigger the Speed War, they go up to a massive 12 dagger gun shots each turn at close range, with AP -1 and Strength 5, maybe even hitting on 4s if you're freebooters and you've triggered their benefit. That's the kind of profile that's efficient enough to grind through anything, even if it's not even their ideal targets like light infantry, and is just stupidly dangerous for 25-point models. That isn't even it though, as they can also charge after that for a bit more damage in combat as well. They're quite likely to be able to get that damage output off with how fast they are, and at least at range they are really tough for the cost too, They get -1 to hit and get 3 wounds at toughness 5. For obvious reasons, they really like the combination of speed wire and freebooters, as we've said. They are maybe one of the best units as well for that speed mob Army of Renown formation. It's got a couple of stratagems that really heavily reward warbikers. Probably their main weaknesses are that they just aren't quite as efficient against hard targets. Their damage output will maybe just quite get there, rather than automatically blow them off the board like they will with most infantry. Bikes can struggle with terrain a bit, and like most orcs, if you are taking them in big squads, you might be subject to leadership issues and a few of them running off. Still though, a really strong unit. I've chosen to rank them 9 out of 10. Next up we come to the buggies. These are the ones that had that errata to only allow you to field one squad of 1 to 3 of them per army, and that certainly has limited their impact a bit on orc lists. Just in general, they are very fast. They all have ramshackle, which helps deal with the mid-strength weapons that would usually be their bane, and they all certainly love the speed wire with the extra AP -1 on the guns and a small boost to the Daka weapons. The first of these is the Boom Daka Snazwacken, and probably the weakest out of the bunch, I think. 90 points per model, and it's armed with the mech special, the one that's fairly good at killing marines with its strength 5 and damage 2. I guess not too bad if it's up close and personal and activating its Daka benefit, and it is a bit tankier than most of the other buggies with -1 to hit, though even with the new points cost rebalancing, I do feel it's probably less efficient firepower than the others, and it's the only one with no melee threat whatsoever, no ram or no boosted combat profile. Maybe I've been a bit harsh on 6 out of 10, it could maybe have been a 7, but I feel like out of any of the buggies, this is probably going to be the last one that most people choose to take. I must admit I'm a lot more favourable about the custom booster blaster. This guy's cheaper at just 80 points per model, and again it's rather good at killing marines, with its pretty nice rivet cannon that can also threaten light vehicles quite adequately. I think really though the big benefit of this guy is that you get 46 flamer attacks up close with its burner exhausts. Combined with speed wire for an extra AP -1, that is actually going to stack a fair amount of damage on anything that it can reach. If it needs to, it can also follow up with the potential for a few mortal wounds with its spiked ram when it's charging, though that is a bit unreliable as to whether or not it goes off. Overall, I do think it's a really quite efficient datasheet. I've ranked it a 9 out of 10. Perhaps its main weaknesses are needing to get up close and personal for those burners to get to work, and even when it does, its damage is very geared towards light infantry, though it's quite nice that the rivet cannon is fairly general purpose. Next up we come to the Megatrack Scrapjet, an 100-point buggy, so a bit more pricey, and pretty much one of the go-to choices for anti-tank firepower in the whole Codex. This thing just has an enormous amount of shots coming out of it. It's usually going to be 7 strength 8 damage 3 shots from the missiles, anything up to 24 shots with the big shooters when you're in speed war, and then on top of that is the best buggy in melee by a massive margin, getting strength 8 melee with damage D3 and also a ram to go on top of that as well. These were only 90 points before, I think a bit undercosted. They're still great at 100. Maybe the main weakness is that they're a fairly high priority target to take out, and maybe aren't so hard to take down for the 100-point investment. Still though, a great datasheet. I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Next up we have the Rocket Shock Squig Buggy. This one's 110 points, having recently eaten a big 20-point nerf compared with before. I still think the points premium is likely to be worth it though. Ignores line of sight shooting is really powerful in 9th edition, great for clearing out those units that are crouching on objectives, or just stacking damage exactly where the opponent doesn't want it, and each one of these puts out 2d6 strength 5 AP -2 damage 2 shots, all hitting on 4s, and then even having a secondary squig launcher that it can activate if the enemies get within 18 inches. That's not the end of it though, as their sword blades make them fight in melee far better than you'd expect for a artillery piece. They've got a squig mine which might situationally help a bit, and an okay custom job in the nitro squigs. If you just filled in just the one model in the unit, then getting a +1 to wound on it isn't the worst. These would easily be a 10 out of 10 if they hadn't had the points increase. Now they have, I think that it's a little bit less auto-include than they were before. They're still an incredibly strong unit, and I'd expect them to crop up in a lot of top lists. Perhaps these more than any of them really suffered from only being able to take one squad of them. They get particularly obnoxious if you can spam them for days, just being a bit of a deletion ray to just gun the enemy units right off the table. Finally for the buggies we come to the Shock Jump Dragster, a kind of mid-priced buggy at 85 points. This one has some surprisingly accurate anti-tank fire from the custom shock rifle, a backup rocket launcher, and again like the Squig buggy, some fairly reasonable melee with those saw blades. This guy's signature move is that shock tunnel for teleporting round the board when it advances, though I must admit I think it's a bit unreliable. It only goes off on a 4+ in general, and when it does go off, you've got a good chance of eating a few mortal wounds. Being able to redeploy is pretty handy, it's just a bit less so if you're not able to guarantee it. I still feel that in terms of anti-tank damage output, these are going to be outshone by the scrap jets. I still think they're pretty usable though. I've rated them an 8 out of 10. Next up we come to the flyers, and I've started out with the Blitzer bomber, probably the weakest of the lot in my opinion. It's 150 points, packs a couple of big shooters and super shooters, but pays quite a premium for an area effect bomb, which gives a chance to do D3 mortal wounds to every unit within 6 inches on the roll of a 4+. You do have the potential for catching a fair few enemies with that, but you're only going to do chip damage to each unit, and it's really unreliable as to whether you damage them at all. If the enemy isn't clustered up, the damage output is kind of terrible, and I just can't really see anyone wanting to take this compared with the other planes. I've chosen to rank it a 4 out of 10, really needs a better bomb rule. Next up we have the burner bomber, which I think is better, maybe not significantly so, but at least it's a bit cheaper at 135 points, though you can also upgrade an extra 15 points for Scorcher missiles if you do want to throw on a bit more anti-infantry shooting. Like all the flyers, it does have the advantage of very fast movement and ramshackle. It will be quite good for getting lines of sight to things that you can't see quite as easily with the rest of the army, which is powerful, but I feel like it's the next two planes that really use that ability to the max. The burner bomb again does an area of effect damage, this time you roll a 5+ for every single model in that radius, and this does have the potential to make it genuinely quite efficient against mass ranked up infantry. Anything fielded in big blobs, say some Skitarii or Necron warriors perhaps. It's got the option for a bit more splash damage as well, with the burn 'em all stratagem. Still though, it is going to be kind of terrible against really quite a lot of armies with elite units. It's really overshadowed by the other two flyers, which are both great, and it lost its signature kamikaze stratagem, which it had back in 8th edition, the one where it could basically suicide to cause mortal wounds all over. Getting into the good planes though, and first up we have the Dakka Jet, 120 points with the extra super shooters, which I would usually take, and it's a really cheap plane for just how much crazy amount of firepower it can chuck out. This plane just absolutely loves being in the freebooters speed war. On the first turn of speed war, if you manage to trigger the freebooters benefit somehow, you've got 42 shots, hitting at strength 6, AP -2, damage 1, and all hitting on a 4+. It's just insane firepower for the points cost of this, particularly with how fast it moves and the fact that you'll struggle to hide from it. That'll stack some hefty damage on an important target. Perhaps one of the main downsides is the flyer nerf, meaning that you can only take 2 of them in tournament lists, and while its damage output is amazing against infantry, it's kind of only so-so against anything with toughness 7 or more, though again you still will pretty much guarantee at least a fair bit of damage going through, even wounding on 5s. Overall I've scored it a 9 out of 10, a really efficient little infantry clearer in the right army. Finally we come to the Warspbomb Blaster Jet, a flyer that's really going to put the fear of Ork flyboys into the enemy army. Massively more expensive than the other choices, 210 points with the extra super shooters and the teleport blaster, even more if you take in the force field. However, just the sheer amount of damage punch on this thing is insane. It hits on 4s at base due to a mech flying it, that's potentially 3s in the freebooters, and that teleport mega blaster gives you 2d6 shots at strength 9, AP -2, damage d3 +3, and it also happens to pack a big gun smasher gun as well. You can then chase that down with the 2 super shooters for 20 points, and that's force field that you have the option for an extra 20 points, gives it a 5+ invul, and also any other planes flying nearby. It does seem to be a really common pick in tournament lists, gives the opponent a threat that they absolutely need to deal with as fast as possible. It's pretty much guaranteed to tear enormous chunks out of hard targets if it does get its alpha strike off. I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10. The only reason it's not a 10 out of 10 is just it's got a very high points cost. This thing really does need to do some hefty damage to justify its existence, and even with the force field it is kind of somewhat fragile. It is only 12 wounds with a 4+ save for over 200. Next up we're moving on to the Lords of War. First up the Gorkanaut and Morkanaut, which were moved here from the heavy support slot. Seem kind of okay for what they do, though certainly not particularly standout. The Gorkanaut does hit hard, it's got a combat threat profile very similar to an Imperial Knight, and backs that up with a bit of shooting as well, 30 shots at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1 up close, can access ramming speed, and has a small transport capacity to boot. However, being a Lord of War and a Titanic vehicle really do come with its downsides. Lords of War either mean that you're not getting a clan trait, or you're going to be trading out bucket loads of CP for 3 of them. It depends on whether you're taking the super heavy auxiliary or the super heavy detachment. They interact very badly with terrain, not getting dense cover and not being hidden by obscuring, and despite 24 wounds, toughness 8 and the 3+ save, they're not actually that durable for their points cost either. Not against the ferocity of 9th edition anti-tank weapons. Not having the ramshackle rule doesn't really help with that either. Overall I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10, Maybe that's a bit on the generous side, they could have been a 6. I think their raw stat line isn't too bad, it's just not really good enough to overcome the whole Lord of War thing compared with other options. I feel it's kind of similar for the Gorkanaut as well, a little bit more expensive at 380 points if you are taking the custom force field, though it isn't really a bad place to mount one. It's got a fairly decent aura with that big base. The Gorkanaut trades out a little bit of combat damage for a lot of anti-tank firepower, shoots a lot harder but hits a bit weaker, and is kind of similar to the Gorkanaut with similar drawbacks like being a super heavy. I feel that despite having an enormous points cut of several hundred points, the Stomper is still behind these. It does have a massive 40 wounds at toughness 8, but at 675 points that still isn't actually that strong for the points cost. At over a third of your army, this thing just needs to be a bit harder to take out, particularly as its damage output doesn't seem to be top tier either. The melee is fun, you do have damage 9 melee on that big claw if it's tangling with heavies, but certainly doesn't seem to fight harder than 2 Gorkanauts next to each other. I guess in general it is maybe a bit more geared to shooting, it does some okay long range anti-armor, and it does have another couple of benefits, a grot rigger crew for a bit of repairs, and the war effigy rule to give orcs reroll morale tests, which is actually kind of handy to have around. The main issue is the points cost, it just still costs too much for what it does. Again, I don't think it's enormously durable, particularly with no ramshackle rule and no invul. I'm not saying that they're definitely necessary for something this size, but it would likely need even more wounds to compensate for it. Moving on into fortifications now, and first up we have the Big Ed Boss Bunker. 75 points for this Orky fortress. It has a transport capacity of 10 models and open topped, so it's a pretty good gun base. It's very tough at 12 wounds, toughness 8 and a 3+ save, has ramshackle for resistance to strength 7 and lower, and considering it's mainly about sitting around being tough, its shooting isn't actually too bad with that gaze of Gork. I still think it's probably unlikely that you just want to have one of these sitting around in your deployment zone. Being immobile does mean that the enemy's got a good chance of hiding from it if there is anything too scary in it. And even though you can equip it with a shouting pole to have a war boss inside it, it's just not quite as good as having the war boss actually out on foot and running around crumping things. I'd say by far the most interesting use for it is the 2 command point teleporter stratagem. Put it in deep strike with a big unit of tank busters inside, appear out of nowhere and unleash rocket hail on any nearby vehicles. I think that would actually be genuinely quite fun to play with, though it is still annoyingly limited by those fortification deployment rules, not being able to set up anywhere within 3 inches of other terrain. That's probably the biggest killer thing for this. I've chosen to rank it a 7 out of 10 overall, as potentially interesting but kind of flawed by the fortification rules. The Mechboy workshop though I'm a little bit less positive about. It's 70 points for basically a bit of battlefield terrain that you can't destroy. It's mainly made up of barricades that give it light cover, heavy cover and defensible. It can be kind of helpful for vehicle repairs. Mechs nearby can pile on an extra wound to injured vehicles. It allows you to do an action to put on custom jobs onto your vehicles mid-game, and in army construction you can double up on custom jobs, taking 2 of the same ones if you want. At least now in the new mission pack you can deploy fortifications a little bit more easily, having the option to trade out some terrain in your own deployment zone if there's literally nowhere to set it up if you do fall foul of those rules. I guess my main criticism is that it just doesn't really do very much for 70 points. Most of the custom jobs aren't really worth taking twice. You already need to have mechs about to actually do the benefits in-game, like the +1 to repairs. I guess the custom job thing is kind of fun, but not really something I'd probably bother with myself. I might be being a tiny bit harsh on it, but I have only rated it as a 4 out of 10. I wouldn't be trying to take this in a strong orc list. Next up we have the Orky dedicated transport in the truck, a cheap 70-point transport that you can fit 10 orcs in. It is open topped, so you can use it as a bit of drive-by shooting if you want to. Though even with ramshackle, I think it is fairly flimsy for the cost, toughness 6, a 4+ save and only 10 wounds. It doesn't really do any good damage output of its own. The wrecking ball and grabbing claw I think are a touch overcosted, but I think by far my favourite use of the truck is for truck boys. The specialist mob where you can get out, move and charge. That works on regular boys, knobs or mega knobs, and that way the transport is genuinely gaining you a whole load of movement. Perhaps one of the most powerful ways to field any of those units. I've chosen to rank the truck 8 out of 10. I think really strong for truck boys, but perhaps not strong enough to be fielded en masse. Finally, let's get into the bosses and other HQs, starting out with the war bosses, speed bosses and beast bosses. With war and speed war, you really are going to want one of these leading your detachments. A lot of the choice depends on what army you're playing, if you're playing for the war strategy or the speed war, and they each do have a bit of an opportunity cost, as you can only take one of them per detachment. It does mean by including any one of them, you're locking yourself out of taking the other choices in that formation. That being said, I do think that every single one of them has a good reason that you might want to field it. They're all decently strong, and I think that Games Workshop has done a good job of balancing them against each other. The most generic choice is the standard war boss, 90 points for a fighty character, can take big choppers and power claws, and that means he's got quite good flexibility over relics, being able to take things like the killer claw or the kill chopper. Like most of the other war bosses, he gives a +1 to hit aura around him, so helps out the other orcs in melee quite a bit. I think he's a really efficient datasheet to lead the force. Again, the main issues are that if you're taking him, you're not taking one of the others, and your choice of faction leader is often going to be swung by the rest of the army, whether or not it makes more sense for your forces to be in a war or a speed war. If you're playing with basically nothing but bikes, buggies and vehicles, then just having a regular war boss to be your main warlord just doesn't make a lot of sense. Not so different from him is the war boss in mega armor, 25 points more. Though if you were shelling out for a power claw on the regular boss, that would only be an extra 15 points over it. The melee profile's really good with that huge chopper of his. He gets a little bit of shooting from that big shooter which hits on force, though the main attraction is really the defense of the mega armor, giving him a 2+ save, far stronger against low AP attacks than the regular boss. I think one of the reasons I like this guy so much is access to Da Crushing armor. That one grants a 4+ invul, +1 to his regular saving throw, and impacts mortal wound hits in combat. And it's just a ridiculous amount of value for one relic slot. Again, the same downsides as the regular war boss apply. Again, really strong in combat for the points, a good character to lead the force if you want a regular war detachment. I've rated him 9 out of 10. Next up we have the Beast Boss, who I think is maybe the most niche out of the war boss variants. He's 95 points and armed with a beast chopper and beast claw, meaning that if you do want him just for raw fighting might, he is both a bit cheaper than a war boss with a power claw and also a bit fightier. On top of that, he does get access to the various beast snagger, warlord traits, relics and stratagems, all of which can be quite good, particularly if he gets in combat with a titanic unit. Getting +2 to the damage of that claw really is quite powerful. He does come with some downsides though. He can't buff regular orcs, just beast snaggers. There's less flexibility in his loadout, and that means that you can't take certain other relics, say for example he can't take the killer claw. Perhaps one of the more niche picks, but in the armies where he is the best leader for the job, I still think he's incredibly efficient. Again, I've ranked him 9 out of 10. Next up we have the beast bosses on Squigosaurs, the regular one and Mosrog Scragbad, the snakebite character. They're significantly more expensive at 175 points and 185 points respectively. They both received fairly decent points increases in the recent chapter approved. I feel they're still kind of fairly costed though, as opposed to the outright crazily strong profile that they were at before. They can be very, very tough to kill. They get -1 damage base, and you can stack the regular beast boss with a 5+ feel no pain and also -1 to wound, which is a pretty horrendous combo for durability. They hit very hard in combat, though Squigosaur jaws can deal out a fair few mortal wounds if they get lucky. They're faster to get into the fray. They give out that same +1 to hit aura for beast snaggers, and for the extra 10 points, Mosrog gets damage 3 on his standard melee and a 4+ invul and a few other bits. Perhaps the main downside is the points cost. In particular, the regular beast boss was very undercosted before. Now it's a lot more in line with his abilities, I think. Again, like the regular beast boss, all their buffs are locked to beast snaggers, and Mosrog does have a couple of downsides of his own. He's locked to snake bites, and he can't take his own choice of warlord traits and relics. For that reason, I'd probably still say that the standard beast boss might well be stronger than him. Still though, these are absolutely monstrous threats to have Loki in the ranks behind character protection. Compete great with the other war bosses. Again, I've chosen to rank them 9 out of 10. Finally, we get onto the speed bosses. The Deathkiller Wartrike is 120 points, and a pretty decent general all-rounder for that. It's fast, he has character protection, reasonable melee, a bit of close range shooting, and he can be a good choice for that 4+ invul save from the Drunk Boss warlord trait. I'd say maybe the biggest advantage of him though is that he unlocks Speed War, and that's certainly one of the more competitive ways to play Orks at the moment. He is also a bit more powerful in the Speed Mob formation. That unlocks a trait where he can get reroll 1s to wound. Outside of that though, it is a bit disappointing that he doesn't have any sort of buffing abilities otherwise, and maybe does just feel like a bit of a tax unit to unlock that Speed War. I have a feeling that he wouldn't be picked quite as much if his datasheet wasn't linked to it. Still though, seeing as he is the model that unlocks one of the more powerful ways to play Orks, he's still going to be seen in a ton of competitive lists, and I've ranked him 9 out of 10. Finally, and crossing briefly into Forge World for this one, as I felt like a discussion of the war bosses wasn't really complete without him, we've got the war boss on Warbike, whose datasheet is available in the Imperial Armor Compendium. He's 115 points, gets a power claw or a kill saw. which again means that you can do some combos with him that you can't do with the Deathkiller Wartrike, things like taking their Killer Claw, or Ed Whopper's Kill Chopper. Otherwise, he is fairly similar to the Deathkiller Wartrike in quite a lot of ways, a kind of similar defensive profile, and the other option if you want to unlock Speed Wire. Again, perhaps one of the most major downsides is not having any buffing abilities, no +1 to hit aura. It seems to be the price that you have to pay if you do want that very nice AP-1 on all your vehicles. Again, very strong and well balanced against the others. Again, I've scored him a 9 out of 10. Moving on beyond the generic war bosses now, we have big mechs. There's 3 flavours within the Codex. I thought we'd talk about the custom force field and mega armoured versions first. They're both 85 points base, though their mega armour one doesn't include the force field. If you want that, that's going to be an extra 30. Both of them are moderately fighty characters, though certainly the mega armoured one more so than the custom force field one, as he can actually get power claws and things. They're both able to repair vehicles for D3 wounds a turn, and the custom force field I still think is a pretty decent defensive upgrade for an Ork army. 6+ invuls are still very relevant to an army with pretty low saves, and you can pay the stratagem to basically blow it up and give you a big bubble of a 5+ invul for a turn. That could genuinely be a pretty big deal if you do need to tank an important round of shooting. Basically the choice is whether or not you just want to have a custom force field as cheap as you can, or whether you also want the character to also have a bit of melee might as well, as of course the mega armor has much better defense and offense than the regular version. You can actually get a very dangerous ranged build for the mega armored one. He hits on force, the teleport blaster is quite nasty, and he's probably the best person to bear the dead shiny shooter if you want to give that one out. A Daka weapon with up to 14 shots and strength 5 AP-1 damage 2. As shooting relics go, that's very strong indeed, essentially the equivalent of almost 5 heavy bolters strapped together if you're up close. I think big mechs are a fairly solid investment. In general though, I think you're going to want to use them in more vehicle orientated forces so they can actually make use of their repairs as well. Now the force field is only up to a 6+, it's just not quite as good as it was. If you do want to make good use of the force field, the army does need to bubble up a bit, which isn't always the most helpful, and it's just whether or not between the force field, the repairs and the melee threat, whether or not it's actually going to be worth the points investment. Probably for some armies that'd be a yes, but others not so much. Overall, I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10, a very solid HQ choice, maybe not quite as mandatory as having a war boss about. For the other big mech though, the one with the shock attack gun, I'm not quite so keen on him at the moment. He's 110 points and spits out a random amount of shooting, random 2d6 strength, d6 damage, and a big AP-5. It is fun to have that amount of firepower character protected like that. Potentially any one roll could be very fearsome indeed. Though for 110 points, it really isn't very efficient compared with most of the rest of the Ork army, and it is the sort of gun that can be very swingy, either doing a lot or doing absolutely nothing. For example, if you compared him to 2 custom mega cannons, they're going to outcompete him pretty much all the time against everything. Overall, I've scored him a 6 out of 10. I guess if there's somewhere that he can safely sit around doing repairs all game while also shooting, that might be enough to justify him. Next up we come to the Weird Boy, a nice cheap 70 point HQ psyker, and he's the one with, in my opinion, the very best spells that the Orks have to offer, +1 attack for a unit to make them more dangerous, the jump to throw a core unit across the board, and Fists of Gork to massively empower one character. It's quite a cheap HQ to fill a detachment with a war boss perhaps, and he does have a little bit of melee himself if the enemy get close. Perhaps the main downside is that if you want to cast 2 powers per turn, he needs 20 Orks nearby. In some armies that's probably not going to be a problem, in some more elite ones are much more so. As a psyker, he is prone to the usual risks of perils of the warp and getting his powers denied, and in some matchups he might actually be a bit of a liability. It means that you can't take the Abhor the Witch secondary against things like Thousand Suns or Grey Knights. Most of the time that will be a very easy pickup. Overall, I've chosen to score him an 8 out of 10, probably on the upper end of the 8s. It's a nice cheap and effective HQ. For the Beast Snaggers though, I just don't think that the Word Boy is on the same level. Basically almost identical to the Weird Boy, he trades out his decent melee for a small shooting attack, which is a bit worse I think, and he's the cheap way to get the Beast Head powers on the board if you want them. Unfortunately, in general I'd say that the Beast Head powers are generally worse than the War powers. If you want the Beast Head powers, then the Kill Rig is probably a better platform to put them on, and he does have the other similar downsides of the regular Weird Boy. Overall, I'd score him a 5 out of 10. I think it's going to be quite rare for him to get played in top lists. Finally, we come to the Pain Boss, the Beast Snagger Pain Boy, an 80 point HQ choice that does very similar things to the Elite Choices versions, a 6+ feel no pain, though annoyingly his healing abilities are only limited to Beast Snaggers, so it kind of depends on whether or not you're going heavy on them. He is very slightly faster than regular orcs, with those bound-in legs moving 7 inches, and he does have a power claw in combat, so he isn't useless there. Compared with the pain boy, he gets an extra wound and attack as well. In general though, I'd say that similar to the pain boy, he's just not quite as relevant without bigger mobs being a bit more common on the field. It's a bit annoying that his healing is locked to the beast snaggers only, and he seems like a lower priority compared with most of the other HQs. Maybe he could be good to run along some Swighog riders perhaps, hopefully saving enough knives as a medic, then getting stuck in with his own power claws. Overall though, a bit of a lower priority one. I've chosen to rank him 6 out of 10. Finally, let's finish up with the named HQs, starting with the biggest and baddest of the lot in Ghazghkull Thraka. He's a 300-point monster, striking with a massive damage 4 melee and a bunch of attacks that get even more frequent as he gets injured, and though he can be directly targeted, he is pretty tough to take out, with a rule that only allows him to take 4 damage per phase. Mork's Roar gives him a bit of anti-infantry firepower, though nothing too outstanding for the cost, and he does seem like a pretty decent linchpin centerpiece for a Goth's army, buffing them in combat, giving them better leadership, and allowing both war and speed war at the same time, really good for certain units like warbikers, who could potentially make decent advantage of both. He is also a supreme commander as well. That does mean that he's quite easy to field and doesn't take up detachment slots unless you want him to. For downsides, even if you aren't going to be able to kill him outright, you certainly can wear him down with shooting before he gets close, and he might struggle to close the distance a bit more than most. He only moves 7 inches, which isn't enormous. He's got the monster keyword and has to move round terrain, not through it, and as a ground-bound, massive melee character, he's maybe a big choice for being tied up or screened by a whole load of chaff. Still though, a fair few competitive Goth lists have been running him. Seems a pretty solid leader for a more melee-focused Orc army. I've chosen to rank him 9 out of 10. For his banner waver Makari, he's a 55-point Gretchin who can be fielded in his own right. He's very lucky with that 2+ invul until it's failed, though it does appear that you can command reroll it. If he's near Ghazghkull, then he really amps up his buffs, giving a 6+ feel no pain out to all the Goths nearby. He buffs nearby Gretchin leadership, has the chance for a few cheeky mortal wounds in melee, and can just be a cheap way to field a Goth's HQ slot if you need to. I think perhaps the most interesting thing about him is the toughness. You could really tank quite a lot of surprising firepower on him if the enemy can only shoot high strength, high AP things, and it kind of makes up for his little to no damage output. Seems okay as a bit of a nuisance choice or one to back up Ghazghkull. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10. For our third Goth's character, we have Boss Zagstrug. He's 110 points, and is basically just a fast and fighty war boss without the actual war boss keyword, so you could field him alongside a regular boss if you just needed another fast melee threat. He's somewhat tough with a 5+ feel no pain, can lead his Stormboys in deep strike if you need him to. It's just a bit sad that he doesn't give Stormboys any sort of damage buff. It would have been nice if he'd maybe given them a reroll once to wound or something. The only thing he does do is help to mitigate morale casualties for them, which isn't nothing, but it also isn't loads. Overall, I think he's not terrible, just not really competing well with the regular war bosses or speed bosses, and doesn't have any flexible warlord traits or relics. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10. Not terrible, but I'm just not convinced that his melee damage is really exciting enough just to do fighting and nothing else. Next up we have Boss Snickrot for 95 points. He's the Blood Axe Commando boss who can deploy forward like the rest of his commandos, and again, as he isn't technically a war boss, it means he doesn't compete for the boss slot. His melee is not going to be killing tanks, but it is really quite decent. 6 attacks at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. His warlord trait is the very good brutal but cunning. He gets +1 to wound if he's near terrain features, he gives +1 to hit for nearby commandos, and gives the enemy a -2 leadership aura, so if he's fighting a horde, he does have a fairly reasonable chance of causing a few morale casualties as well. Generally, I think for 95 points that's very efficient indeed. I think he'd be seen in a few more lists if he wasn't locked to Blood Axes, which means that you have to commit to the faction if you want him. The commandos also recently took that 2-point hit, which certainly doesn't really help out Snickrot, as in general he is going to be happiest leading big mobs of commandos to actually deal damage to the enemy. Still though, I think he's a really efficient character. I've rated him 8 out of 10. For the freebooters, we have Captain Badrug, a 95-point HQ choice, but I must admit I'm really not anywhere near as impressed. He does take your war boss slot, so he does compete with other bosses, but he only really does 2 things. Gives you a 6-inch aura of reroll ones to hit for nearby flash gits and himself, and puts out some kind of mediocre firepower with his special gun Der Ripper. 3 shots at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 3, though only hitting on 4s means that you're going to miss with quite a lot of them. He is quite tough as well, to be fair, with a 3+ save and a 4+ invul. Really, I think compared with a standard war boss, he just really doesn't do enough. He's got bad melee damage, not my favourite warlord trait, You can only take him as freebooters, and in general, if you are taking freebooters, they generally tend to work best with all the big Ork firepower units, most of which tend to be vehicles as their most efficient things. It means that you usually want a speed boss, not a war boss, to lead them into battle. In terms of being strong, I really don't think he is. I've chosen to rate him a 5 out of 10. Definitely want to take a lot more for the fluff and fun factor. A nice captain to lead the Ork pirates into game. Finally, last and arguably least, we have Zogrod Wartsnagger. He's a 65-point HQ choice and has a little bit of cheap melee from his relic grabber stick, his main benefit perhaps being the Swig Stopper special rule, a chance to make monsters fight last when they're nearby. Fights last is really quite powerful. If monsters do become the main thing that everyone fields, then it'll be quite good, but even in the days of Tyrannid Crusher Stampedes, you're going to be running into lots of armies where that's not relevant at all. I think the most disappointing thing about him is his super runt special rule. That's his upgraded Gretchin that could be quite fun, but it's really quite a bad upgrade to be honest. All it gives is a unit of Gretchin that hits on +1, and they can shoot while doing actions. He is only cheap, but he really isn't going to contribute all that much to the battle. I've chosen to rank him a 5 out of 10, not one of my picks of the unique HQs. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our summary of every single Ork unit in Warhammer 40k right now. I hope you found at least some of that either interesting or useful. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you have some hidden gems that you think are underrated here? Or is anything a bit overhyped? Looking forward to any cunning Orky insights. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will try and keep the regular videos coming, and I have made versions of this video for quite a lot of other factions now. I'm sure there'll be plenty more like it in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all these videos does take a serious amount of time to make, particularly enormous ones like this one. They take literally days to make when you're rating and reviewing so many units. If you have been getting good value out of them, then any support on the Patreon is enormously appreciated. It is what allows me to keep on doing this as so much of a full-time thing and keep this sort of thing coming. The link's down in the video description below if you're interested. I do try and give some decent rewards for channel backers, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.